2 in number 15, okay? And I'm looking at number 15, and I'm going to take 1/4 times 2, which is going to leave me with a half, correct? And then I'm going to take the 2x minus 7. And if I take 2x minus 7 and I take that whole thing that was over 2 times 2, these 2's cancel and I'm left with less than 2x minus 7. And then I have a less than 5, and I'm taking that times 2, and I now have less than 10. And I am now solving by adding 7 to all 3 parts, the middle, beginning, and end of that inequality. So I get 7.5. I don't care if you want to keep it as 7.5 or you want to write 7.5 or you want to write it as an improper fraction. Less than, I'm left with 2x, less than 17. And then you're dividing every single one by 2 to finish your problem. And that's how they had those answers that were in the back. Okay? So I am not going to change those right now, but you could have changed those into either decimals or simplified fractions as you like to add those. So 42. This is that story problem that we are looking at it being, so kind of like our averages where it's inclusive, right? So it says the acidity of water in a swimming pool is considered normal if the average pH is between 7.2. That means our lower value is 7.2 and our upper value is 7.8. And it says inclusive, so I know I have to put the equal. It says the first 2 readings in the swimming pool are 7.4 plus 7.9. What is the possible third value? It's exactly like that test question. Only thing, instead of dividing by 4 tests, we have 3 values. So you would start this one in the same way. Thank you. And I'll just have you sit. That's okay. You switch seats and I don't have seat chairs, so I'm just going to have you sit here for right now. Unless you prefer to sit up in front. No, okay. Perfect. I do have over here also, but we will keep you there for right now. Okay? So 42, you need to finish that. I'm not going to finish that one as you are looking at it. 38. Do 2 separate questions. Okay? So when I look at 38 and 40, you are doing just the problem totally by itself. So you're doing the first part in 38. If I'm looking at that, you're taking 4r minus 3 greater than 11, and you're adding 3. You are not adding, and in this case, because this one is the same equation, you can do the same thing, right? You can add 3 on both of those. And you're simply solving it for r. So you get 4r is greater than 14. You divide by 4. It's this or. Yesterday, the one main thing that a lot of you forgot was on the quiz, homework quiz, was graphing. So I hope where it says graph your solutions, you're looking at that, because that's kind of key for what we're doing today. Okay? 40, my hint is if I was looking at 40, I would have multiplied, if I'm looking at this one, I would have first added 5 to get the 5, to get this whole parenthesis by itself in 40. So that if I was looking at number 40, let's see if I can keep that on there. I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but I would have added 5 first. So I have 4y plus 2 in number 40 is going to be greater than 8. And all of this was over 5. And so now I would multiply by 5 on both sides to get rid of this. And then I finish solving. And on this one, I would have started with multiplying both sides by 6. That cancels my denominator here. And so the other part of 40 that I would have looked at, I would have had being 4 minus 3y. And now I have greater than 24. And I finish solving that. And yes, when I divide this one, I am going to have to switch that inequality. Okay? So we are not handing this in today. So if you didn't finish it, you have questions on it, you're not sure about it, you have until, and it's what? It's trying to tell us what, Taylor? Absolute value is what? Abby? a distance from 0. That's all absolute value. It's our distance, right, from 0. Okay, so we're talking the distance from 0 when we are looking at this. So, keeping in mind, when we did this before, we had equalities. Today, they're going to be inequalities. That's why the and or is really important. Before, we had absolute value of x equaled 7. And I had how many solutions? 2 solutions always. And my 2 solutions were x was equal to 7 is 7 points away from 0, and -7. And I don't care if you write it like this, or some of you that like writing it the plus and minus 7, right? Both are the same answers when we look at this. And the only time when I have absolute value of x is equal to a negative number is the only time that I'm going to have x equaling no solution. Because we can't have a negative value, a negative distance, okay? So as you go to that next part down, do you need your device? I don't need it in class if you have your notes on. Yeah, okay, thank you. So, if we are looking, it says, well, what do you do with inequalities? So, anytime you see the less than, or less or equal, this is always going to be your and. Your graph will go between the two. You still have to solve each one individually, and you got to be really careful for this. Anytime you have the greater or equal, this is going to be your or. And if you take a look at the graph, the or is always going away from each other. So it's just kind of like what we did today when we had the and the or. The or goes away from each other almost always. It didn't in one homework question, right? Did you have one homework question where they did not go, I mean, they went away, but the answer wasn't separated, right? The answer should have been all real numbers. So make sure you take a look at that, okay? So when we are looking at it, this represents all the numbers that are in between those. Depending if it's inclusive or not will depend on this. Now, here's the key thing, because you're going to be asked to write what this means, okay? Sometimes you're going to see the story part of this and say, you have to have written in words and you have to translate it to this, okay? So when we look at our absolute value, we have n minus 9 is less or equal to 8. This is the distance away. So that's how far away you are from your absolute value. So this is less or equal from the number. So this is what it's going to look like that I want you to write down. So in words, you might see this in an assignment. All numbers, write the inequality for all numbers that are less or equal to 8 units away from 9. 8 units away from 9. Make sure you write this sentence down because in your homework, I'm going to give you this and you have to translate it to this. So, if I ask you to write an inequality that represents all numbers that are less than or equal, that tells us what inequality to use. 8 units away, that's the number that goes outside of the absolute value, from 9. 9 is what goes inside. Now, they are not solving this one right here. They're not showing you the solving. We do that on the next page. But what I want you to do is we still have to split. So please write split. But this time we are always going to do the opposite. And we want to think of it as opposite, opposite. And then we're going to keep the other one the same. And the reason you want to put the opposite one first, and you'll see that as we go through the lesson as we're doing these problems, is because that's always going to give you your smaller number. And we want the smaller number to be first rather than the larger number. So if I was going to write this, I'm going to write it the same way. N minus 9. But instead of less than, that's my first opposite. Instead of less or equal, I'm going to make it greater or equal. And instead of 8, I'm going to make it negative 8. Does that make sense? Opposite, opposite. Opposite of the inequality, opposite of the number. Is this pretty easy to solve? Add 9, right? Do you see where they got the 1? N is greater or equal to 1, right? Right here. Now we're keeping it the same, and we're going to write n minus 9, less or equal, everything's the same, 8. And when you solve it, you're still adding 9, And that's how they got the 17. So opposite, opposite, same is the key deal when we go to solve these. Opposite, opposite, same. Okay? You turn to the top of the next page. This is kind of their explanation of what we did. Okay? On the top of the next page of your notes, they kind of are saying, okay, here's how we are going to be writing this. First off, when you think of your inequality, it's saying that this has to be at least 24 units from 0. Now, they wrote 8n, and then they have greater or equal, but it's really, right, I'm kind of thinking that it is 0 units. So when you see how many units away, that's always what goes inside this with your absolute value. So at least 24 units from what? From 0. We split it. This is always going to be our opposite, opposite. What two things are you taking the opposite of? You're always taking it of your inequality and the number, okay? So opposite inequality, if that helps to write that down, opposite number. And then the other side is the same. So that when you look at the problem, you can definitely see that you did opposite the inequality, opposite the number. And now you're just solving it like we did today, our compound problems, our compound inequalities. This is an or because it was greater or equal, okay? So, will I be picky on if you use or and? Yes, as we get going through this today, maybe not so much, but after today I will, okay? So making sure, always isolate that absolute value part. Some of you had a hard time with that on that first assignment when we did. Then you're going to split it into the two cases, okay? If it's less than or less or equal, it's always going to be an and. If it is greater or equal or greater, it's going to be an or. And then solve each part like normal, okay? So that's going to be our key thing. So let's practice it. So first off, I just want you to write next to each one, and I'm going to have you talk to your shoulder partner really quickly. Is it an and or an or, okay? And if you need to look up above at what we just said, so right next to number one should be a what? Okay, so talk to your shoulder partner. Number 2 should be and, right? 3 should be and 4 should be or. Okay? So we are going to start number 1 off with our split. We're going to go opposite, opposite first, right? And sometimes I even like to write that opposite, opposite, just because it kind of helps me to remember. I am not taking the opposite of anything inside that absolute value. I am taking the opposite of my inequality and the number that is outside. So I'm now going to have less or equal, and it's going to be -7. And you can start solving that, okay? On the other side, I'm going to have 2k minus 1, and I'm going to have greater or equal to 7. And they are not asking us to graph any of these. We just have to solve them, okay? So here I'm always adding 1 all the way across, right? Everything's the same where I'm doing that. So 2k, if we are looking at it, is less or equal to -6. 2k is greater or equal to 8. When you go to solve it, I would take the answer written either when we're looking at it for our or. You always have to have that word or in your answer. And I am going to have, as I look at that first part, I am going to have what, Kylie?
K is less than or equal to -3.
Less or equal to -3. And Mallory, if I do the next part, I'm going to have K is
greater than or equal to 10.
yes. Okay. If we split this next one, start me off with my split, Sanjay. The opposite, opposite. I'd write what?
4r plus 1 is greater than or equal to -9.
Okay.
And 4r plus 1 is less than or equal to 9.
Okay. So, please start with solving those ones, right? Reckon if we're solving, first step is to do what with everything?
Subtract.
Subtract 1. So I'm doing that all the way across the board, right? Once I've done that, Owen, what did you end up with?
R is greater than or equal to -10.
Keep going. And 4r is what also?
Less than or equal to 8. 8 minus 1.
How about just 8?
Like I said,
I thought you said negative 8. So if we are looking at this, is it okay to have fractions or decimals? Yes, by all means. Okay. So if I am looking at this, Jack, what are you ending up with?
R is greater than or equal to negative 2.5 and R is less than or equal to 2.
I will take it with the word and. I saw a lot of you in your homework, when you saw those graphs with the and, you just automatically put the letter R in the middle, and you did less or equal to 2. And then, if I read this, it says R is greater or equal, which means it has to open towards the R, and it has to be negative 2.5. I will take the and, always written this way, if you don't want to use the word and. I will always take it this way. And when you do that, you're always putting your smaller number and your larger number here, and you have to make sure your inequalities are right. Now, if you get this put in here and you keep this one flipped the other way, and you have it as negative 2.5 less or equal, it is not the same answer, and I have to mark it wrong, okay? So if you struggle translating it from this word and to this, then don't do it. Just leave it that way at this point, okay? So, first step in number 4. What do I have to do first, Elena?
Split it.
No. Cannot split first. Why can't I split first?
Oh, I was looking at number 3.
Oh, number 3, you're definitely going to split, okay? And number 3, if we were going to split that, 2/3 P is going to be greater than negative 8. We're not going to solve that one. You guys can do that. That's pretty easy, right? And 2/3 P is going to be less than 8. But if we go to number 4,
Subtract 4.
we got to subtract 4 first. Is there ever going to be a case when we might have, and I'm going to use X because my S's sometimes look like 5, so I'm going to make it an X instead. And we have greater than 16. All right, so if we are splitting, wouldn't you give me one of my splits?
8s minus 16 is less than negative 20.
No. We just subtracted 4 from both sides. Right?
Oh, negative 16. Sorry.
Less than negative 16. Right. And 8x over here minus 16 is going to be greater than 16. Okay? So if you go through to solve that, and we are looking at it being an or, your 2 will always be separated. And if you look at that, you should get, by adding 16 to both sides, and then dividing by 8, you should get one answer being S is greater than 4, and the other one being less than 0. Okay? Does it matter which order you put your answers in? Does it matter if you put X is less than 0 or X is greater than 4? Does it matter? No. As long as you have that word or in there that we are looking at, okay? All right. So this is where you are going to be asked to write, if you remember our distance problem when we had the person walking with absolute value, this is when it will tell you a company. And I do agree that when you look at this problem, you could solve this without absolute value. You could totally solve it without absolute value. You could, when you read the question, and we are reading this, okay? So, Kate, you want to read first?
A company makes boxes of craft edition weigh 213 grams. A quality control inspector randomly selects boxes for any box that varies from the weight by more than 5 grams is sent back. What is the range allowable weight for a box of crackers?
And I will have someone say to me, Mrs. Thompson, I can do this totally without this absolute value. I agree. Because what are they doing to 213? They are adding 5 and subtracting 5. That's what it is. But my standard says you got to be able to write like a basic inequality absolute value. And on the test, it's going to ask you to write an inequality. Okay? So this is what I will look for on the test. I will look that you can write this absolute value inequality. Could you totally solve this without doing absolute value? Yes. Some of the Algebra 1 problems are somewhat contrived because it's just, you can't do the real math things that are like super hard and have you write an equation. So we have to practice it with easier stuff until you get there. Algebra 2, there's a lot more stuff that's really like more real life and not as contrived, I would say. So just understanding that when you look at this, this is the difference from the actual. We wanted it to weigh 213, so the 213 goes inside our absolute value, within less or equal to 5 grams. And then you're just doing the split and solving it, okay? So if I was doing the split, it's W minus, and I'm not going to solve it, 213. We're going to have greater or equal to -5. And when you add that, that's how you got 208, right? And then the other split is going to be W minus 213 would be less or equal to 5. Both cases, you're going to add 213 to solve it, and that's how they got 208 and 218, okay? But this is what it'll look like on the test where I ask you to write an absolute value, okay? So let's practice it with this one. Manufacturer wants you to make 32-ounce box of pasta. Not every box weighs exactly 32 ounces. Allowable difference is ideal is 0.05 ounces. Write an inequality. Try it right now. Try. What do you have, Abby? Double Abby in the front. Double Abby in the pink. Or in the, yeah.
The number in 32 absolute value is less than or equal to 0.05.
Yes. Nice, right? Making sense? Okay, hopefully you checked with your shoulder partner. So as we solve W minus 32, less or equal, if we're going to do the opposite, right? So we got to do our split is what we're thinking. It's greater or equal to -0.05. The other one is W minus 32 is less or equal to 0.05, keeping it exactly the same, right? You're adding 32. What should it be in between? This is an and, so a lot of times with the and, instead of writing the word and, we will put the W in the middle, right? And our inequalities were less or equal and greater or equal. So when we added 32, we had 32, right? 0.05. And when we subtracted, we were left with 31.95. Watch the decimal place. Okay? So, the only thing you see left in your notes is what's on the test, and we won't talk about that until Thursday. Okay? So tonight, this assignment, if you didn't finish last night with the A11, kind of do that on your own time, but today in class, I want you to start with these. And you will notice that it says for 33 to 47 odd, solve and graph, right? I would recommend that you might want to try 48 just because it's another practice with writing that, but it's not hard, okay? So, you should be ready. Tomorrow, we'll hand in the 204. I don't know if we'll hand in page 211 also. But tomorrow we will have a homework quiz on that compound inequalities and writing that. So it'll be just a short homework quiz. I'm going to pass the one from today back. You should leave room for each problem. So when I start number 33 on your paper, I am going to write down the exact problem. You are then going to do the split. You're going to have your 2 written with the split. And then my recommendation would be to do your solution. Now this one's pretty nice because it's the distance from 0, right? And your answer should have came out to be 5 and -5. If I was doing the first split, Taylor, what would I write for my first equation if I'm doing opposite? I would have x is greater than -5. This is going to be an and, right? Then I'm going to have x less than 5. Open at -5, right? Like we did today with our and, up to open at 5. If you do not like writing it and leaving this answer, I am completely okay if you rewrite it as x less than 5, x is greater than -5. Just know that when you read this, you are always reading the variable first, okay? So when you read this, you are always reading your variable first. So you don't ever want to read this as -5 is less than x is less than 5, okay? Because it's not really less than -5. You're talking about everything in between here, okay? So do the split as you're doing them. Starting with 35, they definitely get different numbers every time. Do a couple, check it in the back.